All right.
We got a good crew already. This is awesome.
Yeah, we're filing in here.
I feel like we're part of the distance learning curriculum going on right now. There's like 3 Zoom calls going on all in my house at the same time.
Nice.
Mine too, which explains the lag.
Yeah, in my case, one of them is a craft project involving the creation of dragon eye amulets. So we're going to have to keep this conversation pretty lively to compete, but I bet we can do it.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, that is kind of tough competition. Yes.
What if we do introductions? And that'll give other people a few minutes to show up if they want to. We do not have a strong agenda here. Really, the goal is just like, we've got so many awesome people we keep meeting in the Slack channel, and we just want to get more time together, get to know each other. So,
yeah.
And of course, if you've got specific questions or an agenda to push, we're happy to hear it out. But yeah, we're mostly just looking forward to meeting people.
Yeah, you go first.
Oh, I was gonna. Okay, I can go first. I'm Abe Gong. One of the people working on Great Expectations for the last few years. James is the other guy, and Eugene and Kyle are both on the team now. I'll let them introduce themselves, but my background's in data science, data engineering, mostly kind of between healthcare and tech. So I've done a bunch of work with mostly growth stage companies that are building out tech stacks and trying to make sense of their data and trying to make cool things happen in the world, often something to do with healthcare. It's nice to meet you.
I'll go next. I'm James Campbell, the other of the original contributors to Great Expectations. My background is it's actually been kind of flipping back and forth throughout my career on the quantitative and qualitative analysis sides. I started off doing economic analysis, but then I spent the vast majority of my career doing cyber threat modeling, and then a little bit of kind of shifting that over into political modeling. And I joined Superconductive a year ago as part of our broader pivot into Great Expectations as a central part of the company. So it's been a lot of fun to get to devote more time and energy to this project.
Eugene, so one of non-original developers on GE. My background is software engineering, product management, data science, and like data quality and kind of how machines and people talk about data. That's like one of the things that truly excite me.
I'll round it out for the GE team. Kyle, I am heading up the DevRel and helping the community grow. So you'll see me a lot in the Slack channels and in the forums, just sort of providing structure and things of that nature, less in terms of actually developing the tool that you use, Great Expectations. But feel free to reach out to me anytime you guys have questions about the community, or if you want to promote anything, any tools that you're doing, building with Great Expectations. And I'm gonna go ahead and call people out now. So Kenny, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Kenny Hunt. I am a data person at Tucas, supposedly a data scientist in Surrey, but mostly just building the data engineering team right now. And I want that much. Okay. Probably another person should introduce themselves right now.
Okay. All right, Adam, do you want to go for it?
Give me enough.
Yeah, I think you said me. Hey everybody, nice to meet you. My name is Adam Roderick. My company is Data Tier. We work with mid-sized companies that have a hard time justifying a full data team. And so we've got an end-to-end process and platform, and we pull a lot of tools together. And I'm really interested in Great Expectations. I see a lot of benefit to it. I'm brand new to it, but looking for ways to understand it better and how it might fit how it fits in an end-to-end kind of process. So thanks for doing these office hours. Looking forward to getting to know you a little bit.
Thanks, Adam. All right, Anthony, you want to go for it?
Hey guys, I am a data scientist for a startup in New York called Flex. They're still pretty young on the analytics side, so I came in and realized pretty quickly that their data warehouse was a mess. Built this really bad tool for trying to monitor data and realized that it wasn't very good, which is how I ended up finding you guys. Really enjoying the tool so far. Great work.
Thanks, Anthony. All right, Christina, do you want to go?
Sure. I'm a data engineer at NBC Universal in New York City, currently working from home, yay. My background is data science, but I moved laterally to data engineering and really software development. Just because I think there are very interesting problems to be solved there. Anyway, I'm presenting about the great expectations today to my team. I don't know how that's gonna go. I'm very new to it, but I heard about you guys. First, I think it was the data engineering podcast, and then there was a talk on a data council. And did a watch, so I thought it was really good tool to try. We do get a lot of data, and this seems to be easily deployable, and out of the box you get a lot of functionality. You move very fast, so I have trouble keeping up with the API. So I looked at it 3 times. This is like the 3rd time I'm looking at it. Changed version again. So, yeah, I have a little bit of trouble now because now I really want to deploy it. But I'm hitting some issues because the data cannot leave the cluster where it is right now. It's private S3 bucket. So and also our stack is Scala. So Python is not very welcome, but I'm trying to change that. So
Cool.
I don't know how it's gonna go today. Could go either way, I don't know. Yeah, that's for me.
Well, you should definitely, maybe afterwards, we can talk about helping, giving you any materials you need to present, or if you want to go over some points afterwards, be happy to. Thanks, Christina. Roman, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I am Roman. I am a data engineer at Avanade. It's in Seattle. We've been working in a machine learning project, and we were having some data quality issues. So we were starting to use Microsoft's data drift package. And we very quickly found out that it was very difficult and not that really useful package. And then my colleague here, Anders, found out great expectations, and it was everything we were looking actually. So thank you a lot for that.
That's my favorite quote of the day.
Thanks, Roman. Anders, would you like to go next? Sorry for
Sure.
keeping you in the waiting room for a while there.
Oh, no, don't worry about it. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So like Roman said, we're like a data science machine learning team, and we work heavily with Azure Machine Learning Service, which sort of has its own sort of like Python orchestrator that's similar to Airflow, but different. So it allows you to write Python scripts and orchestrate them in a DAG. And again, like Roman said, we had lots of data quality issues. I find generally most of our pipelines, they're just in-memory pandas pipelines. There's nothing particularly computationally expensive about them, but rather it's sort of the orchestration of featurizing all of these different data sets and bringing them together in a consistent way that becomes challenging. And one of the pain points, I love pandas a lot. One of the pain points is, since it's not strongly typed, is you get these error messages that are you cannot group by on this index. And it takes a really long time to understand. You actually realize oh, it's because I forgot to pass this column. And
like that's where the allure of Great Expectations comes in handy for me, is because you can get those error messages back exactly very quickly and have them be very informative, as opposed to sort of like Panda stack trace errors that tend to not be so informative, when 90% of our errors in our pipelines are just schema related and expectation related. So the challenge that we're looking at, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was saying the challenge that we're facing right now is how to, since all of these these steps that are orchestrated happen sort of on independent computes, we would like, in our ideal world, like to sort of have an expectations on the outputs of every single step. And what's the way to sort of like to minimize sort of the code footprint and boilerplate code that's required to be able to set up our suites on all the different steps without sort of having to like dump these expectation files more than just the JSON into every single step. It's kind of what we're thinking about, if that makes sense. Again, pretty new to Great Expectations though.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. What I was going to say a second ago is I love that you're making the connection to typing. I mean, we started off thinking of this as a validation library, but increasingly we're thinking of it as also a typing, or like the data version of typing. And that actually ends up being a really deep technical well to draw from.
And there's a Panda schema library. There's a couple versions. There's a couple things where people just say like, let's just create simple schema constructs for pandas. And that was another alternative that we had considered, like even just to know like this function expects the df to have these columns would be something really quick to spin up, that it seems like less robust than Great Expectations, but still quite valuable and like minimal footprint.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anders. All right, last one, Bob, go for it.
Hi, sorry for being a little late. I lost track of time. So I'm working for a small healthcare company. We're ingesting data. The data we get has various quality, and I'm just trying to, ideally, I'd like to use Great Expectations to not only identify columns that are rows that don't meet our expectations, but then split the data up into, this passes, this doesn't pass. I've got our pipelines right now are orchestrated through a series of custom software that was written before my time on AWS, and now we're moving to GCP. But essentially I have these sort of a lot of CSV fixed with file formats, and I just want to check, because the data schema we'll get from the manufacturer will say, oh, it's supposed to be an integer, but then they'll anonymize some columns and they'll throw in a few X's, so now the integers aren't integers or things of that sort. So I've built a lot of pipelines. I'm a big fan of pandas. I use pandas a lot, and to Anders' comment, I'd like to do the same sort of thing. Check my schema, my data frames, and I'm doing that sort of on my own by extracting the columns and then comparing them to sets. But this is my job, and I basically is processing and checking the data that's coming into this company. So
awesome. Thanks, Bob. All right, so everyone's introduced themselves. I'm gonna let Abe and James sort of run with it from here to talk about sort of how we got to this point and where we're going, and we can get into specific questions after that.
Well, I think firstly, thanks everyone for coming. It's really fun to hear just how different we have, like different use cases we have, even in the room today, and also what similar kinds of problems people face. I will say it was really interesting for me when I first was like thinking about Great Expectations. I was like, oh, well, these expectations about like what columns are going to be there are going to that's not going to be what brings people in the door, because that they're going to just want to build their own for just that. But what I realized is people are really smart, and they realize that you want to get in with a really robust library at the very beginning of the data quality journey, and then have it be able to be a part of your process all the way through, which seems like is a trend we see a lot. There were a couple things that people flagged that I would love to revisit and almost like just dive in on, because I think that sometimes it's actually just really useful to talk through like how would we approach a particular problem. and that is a great way to get insight into just like how we think about data quality and the use of great expectations. Is that something people would like to do?
Sounds good.
Well, one thing. Okay, so I'll pick one. But then please, like somebody, throw like if you want to like dive into your problem more deeply, let's do that. One thing that I thought was a good question is like, how do I deal with this need to split data up into data that passes and data that doesn't pass? Because I think that's just a really common problem. Another one that I thought would be really useful to talk through is how do I manage this process of like having distributed compute, but wanting to make sure that my expectations are available everywhere without shipping things around. Well, how about let's put those two on the docket, and then you can either voice them, chat, or put in the chat with any other questions, and we can talk through them.
Could I make a comment?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found, I've been a intermittent and novice of Great Expectations for a long time. And I remember when you first published the package, there wasn't a lot of the infrastructure that you have now for the pipelines. So I think that the two things you mentioned are really good, but I'm actually, as I'm trying to get more up to speed, I'm getting confused of like, how do I do it as part of the pipeline? Because you have it very structured and you've abstracted a lot of the setup. But then I also want to just use Great Expectations within my code. And as you go through like splitting it up, if you could look at it from both perspectives, well, if I split it up through the pipeline where I create the data context and I have the data docs or Panda docs and all that, or just how do I do it without all of that sort of infrastructure? Because in times I want to do one and in times I want to do the other. And I've been frankly, I've been struggling a little bit with your documentation and tutorials because I think it's very focused on the pipeline side of things. So I just
the pipeline side, like you mean the kind of heavier weight, more managed data context?
Well, the first thing that you talk about is you download Great Expectations and then you create up sort of your GitHub repository, and then you do Great Expectations init, which then sets it up. Right. So, and then you're basically, then you can profile it and you can look at the Pandas docs, and I've done that and I've walked through the tutorials, and the tutorials are great for that. But if I have a data frame, I'm in a Jupyter notebook and I have a data frame, I just want to run a profiler on it. And I gotta believe there's a way to do that, but I haven't figured that out. Or I want to set up the I set up the expectations and I edit it, and like you said, I want to split it up. So I'm sure there's ways to split it up through the pipeline and applying the whole expectation suite to a data set coming through. But is it possible just to run it on a data frame? And I kind of view it as sort of two use cases that you're looking at in terms of, I've got this whole pipeline I'm setting up, and you've got someone who's just doing the exploratory analysis. And I know it's possible because you make allusions to it in the documentation, and you talk about Jupyter notebooks. But for someone who's just starting out, it's hard to put the pieces in place on how to go one to the other.
Can I say it's not two problems? I almost think it's like an operationalization issue, and it's like a maturity, right? Like with any expectations, you're kind of like, I really have no idea what this data even looks like from an expectation perspective. Like, let me tool around with it. And that for me, that's classically, that happens in Jupyter. But then from there, it's like, how then do you industrialize and put this onto our data platform, or our streaming process pipelines? For me, it's kind of just a process.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, and I think I agree with that totally. I think because when I start off small and I start just looking at the data set in the Jupyter notebooks, it's hard because a lot of documentation goes through more the industrialization of the process, and it's like even getting some of the terminology without seeing it both ways has been challenging for me. But I'm not the brightest of people, so I readily admit that.
That's a great point. Really good feedback. It's something where I think it's really nice to hear that you were with the project from the beginning, because you're 100% right that at the beginning with Great Expectations, the library had no consideration at all for managing your expectation suites, doing deployments across environment or any of that. And so you're right that like as we've evolved and added more of that, it sounds like what we haven't done is kept the documentation sufficiently. Probably what's happened is we've been adding documentation about the new behaviors without probably sufficiently highlighting the availability of the other things. So actually, let me talk very briefly about that. And then Ava, why don't I stop for a little bit and let you take the next question, so I'm not talking the whole time. So with respect to that, like, hey, I just have a data frame, that is absolutely still available. Now, it is the case though that we really encourage everyone to be using a data context now. That's really because it has indeed become a central part of the workflow, and that does add, sort of one additional step above what used to be required. Now, you don't have to use a data context, and you can just create the data context like right in line in your notebook if you wanted to. And what we should do is I can take a note to add some better tutorials around that workflow. In that case, basically, supposing, for example, that you're using pandas, what you're doing is routing through the data context to get back your pandas dataset object in just the same way that you did before. And then that pandas dataset object has all the operations that it has, in terms of declaring and validating expectations interactively, doing exploratory analysis, and then saving the suite. So while the behavior is a little bit harder to find, I think you're totally right. Like it is absolutely still there. And I personally, when I'm going through the process of exploratory analysis, that's always my workflow. I always start by just firing up a notebook, grabbing some data, and running expectations on it. So yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm not sure that like just reassuring you that it's there answered your question fully though. Is that like what is there something more specific?
I knew it's there, and I found it. I'm looking for it, but I haven't been able to do it myself. And I've gone to the YouTube videos, and some of the YouTube videos it looks like they're out of, because they were a year old. You guys are moving so fast, which is fantastic. And you can see the maturity of the Great Expectations getting better and better and better. But for someone who's trying to learn it, and it's like, oh, well, I watched this video and it doesn't match exactly.
Yeah, that friction is so frustrating.
Right. And I'm not, I'm just trying to give you feedback, because I do think that, like you said, everything's there. It's just more a question of having some, I think, basic tutorials on how to use it from the Jupyter Notebook would establish context to make sure I understand how to do it through the greater pipeline.
Can I get really specific on this?
Sure.
Actually, share screen. Let's see. Okay, we are in one of those Zoom modes where you can share screen. So I'm going over to the docs right now, because it sounds like you've looked at these recently. And I mean, if you've been paying attention, we just did a huge revamp of docs like 2 weeks ago. Here's where we are right now. If you go into tutorials, there's this getting started guide that is, as you said, very opinionated. It's like the first thing you do, you're going to initialize the data context. You're going to set up all what you've called the industrialization of it. We're trying to make that as short and slick as possible so that anybody can do it in 5 minutes and it's not a big barrier. But it does introduce all of these concepts along the way. And I can see how that's potentially overwhelming. And especially if you're in this exploratory mode where you just want a notebook, you want expectations. I feel like it feels like you're given a sledgehammer when all you want is tweezers, right? Is that fair characterization?
I've gone through this, and I've gone through it very recently, within the last week, and I know you've had some updates, and I've gone to the how-tos. And what I find with as I'm stepping through it, you are providing a lot of the details, which is good. But what I find is, as I'm trying to sort of like step through one step at a time, I do one step, and I've actually thought like I've gotten through some sort of path where I couldn't get back. It's like I've done a step, and then I have a lot of explanation, and then it says go back to the tutorial, and I've actually lost the steps of where I am. It would, you know, what I've actually tried to start doing myself is I've tried to create a Jupyter notebook and say, well, I just want to run, you know, here's the simple things that I want to do, and just get an idea of, okay, well, how do I create a data context outside of the init, and what does even a data context mean, that sort of thing. I'm very much I like and I think most people like a hands-on approach with the short tutorials. And what, you know, I feel like I'm being hypercritical, but it's really just because I'm trying to give you feedback and where I found challenges, because I have spent time and struggling with your documentation, and I know you've spent so much time on it, and it's good. But I think it's good from a perspective of, if you've been using expectations for a while, you sort of know how it's all put together.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I mean, I think for me, the broad story of it is we started off in this like kind of no infrastructure, notebooks only world. And then the pendulum swung and we put a lot of work into being able to productionize it. But now that's more of the emphasis. And we're kind of now working back to a synthesis where both of those workflows work really well and work together. And I think the implied criticism is right. Like, I don't think we've nailed it yet.
So, sorry, just as a product manager and note taker, so like to capture this use case, right? So I think the use case that you're talking about, right, is basically how to use GE in an exploratory notebook with pandas, right?
That would be, yes, that would be extremely helpful.
Okay, awesome. This is, I mean, sorry, I'm just like, this office hours already producing so much awesome stuff.
I think you'll be happy to hear I actually started working on that one this morning. The idea, actually, let me share screen one more time. What we're hoping to do is set it up so that these how-to guides are like very quick, consumable, like you do one operation and, you know, just like really step-by-step guide to doing whatever needs to get done. Oh, this one doesn't have it, actually. For each of them, we're starting to put in this prerequisites. And I think the thing to look for is a lot of them are going to say, set up a working deployment of great expectations, which basically means, hey, you've done GE init, you have a data context, that all works. But there are going to be some that I think we want to group together in one place and call it kind of like the magic-free version of great expectations, where it's, you don't need to do anything ahead of time. You just pip install great expectations and then run a notebook or you know, get into a workflow.
And do you use Google Colab for that?
Sorry, say again.
Could you use Google Colab for that? I mean, I, for example, used Google Colab for demos for some things successfully.
That's a good question. I think I'm the least experienced Google Cloud person on the team, so I haven't personally done it. I don't know of any reason you couldn't, but I haven't personally done it. Just to close out the thought though on this, what I'm hoping to do is collect a set of how-to guides that focus on, that basically say, look, for these guides, you don't even need to have a data context. These things are kind of the magic-free version. Put that in one place so that they're easily discoverable. And then hopefully that gives you like a really easy on-ramp where you don't have to absorb all of the main, like all of the kind of heavier concepts for productionization before getting and doing good work in notebooks. I just want to sanity check the idea. Does that sound directionally correct?
It sounds good to me.
I'll say, I think there's also like a different approach or a complementary approach, which is just that we need to ensure that all of the operations that are available are clearly demonstrated how to do them using the raw Great Expectations API instead of exclusively relying on the command line. So that for people for whom they are, you know, working all the way through in a notebook are able to just fire up the notebook and go. And there's no, you know, there's no additional hurdle that they have to go through. And that's something that we've actually begun doing some different prototypes or like documentation for. So I love both of those ideas. Can I switch us over to another question that was just a concrete one? And I think, Anders, you asked this question of when I have a bunch of different data transformation operations that I'm doing in pandas in different environments, how can I make sure the expectations are always available and like have a nice slim deployment without doing a big heavyweight great expectations installation everywhere? Is that a pretty good characterization of the question?
I'd say so. Without getting, I want to say yes. I want to give more information, but I feel like it's sufficient. Roman, do you think? Is there anything that's missing from his statement?
Sorry, can you repeat the statement?
Well, let me try my attempt at reiterating your reiteration, James. With more detail in that, like, you get to provide an entry script. So basically what we have is a repo, and every folder has what gets sent to each operator, I think is the Airflow word. So there's an entry script, and there's also a source directory associated with it. So only the files that are in that source directory get sent. We also get to provision like a Conda environment that also gets sent. So you could imagine, like, obviously, like, Great Expectations will be in the environment on that step. But as far as the information needed to, like, we have the script that's actually the data processing pandas pipeline that we want to have run. But then in addition to that, like, what's the minimal footprint? Like, is it, and I say this without having worked very much with Great Expectations, Roman's done a lot more. Is it simply just like a JSON that's saved alongside the script that can be accessed? Is that the minimal footprint?
Yeah, great question. Actually, I would say the bare minimal footprint is even lighter than that, because using a data context, you can have Great Expectations fetch this suite from, like, for example, S3 or some other remote store.
Got it.
So, like, at the very, very minimal deployment of what we call that pattern like a checkpoint. The very minimal checkpoint is just the configuration of that checkpoint. Which can be as light as a couple of dictionaries that you put right in your source file, or you could put it in JSON adjacent as well.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, of course.
Because this is, I think one thing that we have is, so basically a lot of this infrastructure is put in place because all of our sort of data munging to create a gold data set to be ready for training, lots of times, like, this pipeline's locked down, but you can create a feature branch and make some tweaks to it. But basically, we want to know when someone on our team has said, like, oh, you have to engineer these new features for the model as a hypothesis. This is what our stakeholders think. We want to be able to know before we allow that pull request to go into our development branch or master branch deploy. We want to know, like, has this messed with any of the previous expectations? So currently, the approach that we're moving away from is like snapshot testing, right? Where we're taking, like, one random user from 1 year, and we're snapshotting to paint, like, here's what the feature branch looks like, here's what the master branch looks like. And in that way, we're kind of like have under source controlled our expectations. So that would be my question, is like, I totally see from the most minimal perspective, we could have like the suite could live in an S3 bucket. Like, is it best practice for people who use Great Expectations to keep the expectations under version control? Because for me, being able to see that diff kind of helps us understand, like, how much gatekeeping we need to do on a feature branch.
Again, just a delightful question. I would say that yes, our official best practice is you should be using version control to store expectations. That said, S3 has a concept of version control. It's not useful for validating during pull request time, but it is still available to you. So that's, I think, part of how we feel comfortable with the idea that the benefit of being able to have that distributed store in many cases can outweigh the burden or the cost of not having that beautiful diff. But yes, having the diff on the suites is just a really lovely experience. And we've actually, in the last couple of versions of GE, done some work around ensuring that we have really consistent formatting so that those diffs really are, like, pretty easy to read right at the time.
So in that case, the footprint would be that then we would have, like, the JSON of the expectations for every step.
Yes, in that case, actually what you'd have is the JSON of the expectations as well as the configuration for your data context, the method that you use to grab those expectation suites. And in your case, actually, what you might be doing is kind of a hybrid where you might use a shared S3 bucket to store validation results, so the output of each of those, but still keep your expectation suites in your Git repository.
Cool. I like that. Thanks for humoring me.
Great question.
Oh, Abe, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Christina, you asked a big question in the chat. So like, what's the plan for future releases, and when do we get to 1.0? It sounds to me like there are maybe two things there. There's like an upside, like, ooh, what goodies are coming? And there's also a downside of like, and what breaking changes are you going to subject me to? Am I parceling that correctly?
Yeah. Also, when can I actually? Right. Breaking changes in regards to if we deploy this to production, will there be a lot of, keeping up with the breaking changes? Right.
So I'll let James speak to breaking changes in a second, because he's kind of the keeper of the keys on that. I'll answer the easy one, which is kind of other features before 1.0. There are a bunch of like small to medium-sized things that we see fitting in, but like the really big one that we see as kind of an important capstone for the project is what we call multi-batch profiling. And the notion there is to be able to configure data sources so that you can point profilers at kind of like deep longitudinal data, and actually have the profiler do not all of the work, but like a lot of the work of figuring out, what does my data look like? What are reasonable parameters for this data? And we don't believe that this is ever going to be AI in the marketing sense, or that it's ever going to like automate away the need for domain knowledge. But we do think that there's some like really powerful tools that could make much better use of existing data when you're coming up with expectation suites. And I think by the time you do that, the docs start to look much more like a fully fledged data catalog, and it becomes much easier to populate them and update them. So at a minimum, I think those things need to get done before we feel like, yes, this, like, we've reached a good stable point, and we're really going to freeze features and launch a 1.0. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to make a ton of breaking changes in the meantime, but like that's what we think of as kind of the big objective we're shooting for in hopefully the next few months.
Cool.
So yeah, to the question of breaking changes, I think several people have mentioned that, hopefully in a good way, we've definitely been moving a lot more quickly recently, and we've been adding features, and we've been working as hard as we can to ensure that we're keeping backwards compatibility where possible, and also looking ahead to build in place the API and configuration requirements that we're going to need in order to build in new features. So for example, some additional areas of development that we're likely to push on fall into some bins, and Eugene's done a really good job of kind of, for our internal conversations, like creating these like thematic groups. And some of the additional thematic groups where you're going to be able to see changes are in more enhanced customizability of Great Expectations. So like the ability to create custom expectations even easier, and ensure that you can create the data docs for those also very easily. Now, some of those are going to require some breaking changes. Now, again, look, we've been working very hard to ensure that there is a very clear upgrade path through those. So when I say breaking changes, I don't mean something like completely disruptive where you'd expect your team to have to come offline and spend a week doing an upgrade. But definitely a change where would require some attention. And then the other area being sort of expressivity. Now, meaning new expectations. And for those, I don't think we're going to need to introduce any significant breaking changes. So the net of that is, I think, like Abe gave the timeline, the next few months probably for the concept of this like additional enhanced profiling, and then working on customizability. And I do think that just like realistically, we are going to see several of these kind of version increments in the O series. So before we really lock into a stable API. But that said, I really do see us getting to that stable API in like, I don't know, I'd say like within this year kind of timeline. Just because we've been working really, really hard to think through like what are the operations that we really want to be, sure are available in Great Expectations. And even before then, again, what I would absolutely not hesitate in encouraging you to feel free to use it in production. I would just make sure to pin on the second version, and then consult when consult our upgrade guides when it's time to do that.
So just to add one thing, right? So like we definitely consider migration of projects that are already in production very important. And you saw probably that we have an actual CLI command now, check config, that allows you, at least gives you instructions what to do when migrate between versions, right? And in the documentation, there is a migration guide between every kind of significant, I and I+1. So from there, it will be only better. But we already consider it important.
Can I ask maybe opening up a can of worms, but is that enough? And I'll say like every time we release a breaking change, we kind of kick ourselves a little bit and think like, oh man, like if we'd just seen this better a few months ago, we wouldn't have to risk thrashing our users. It's all be simpler. But at the same time, like we're also not going to make any change that we don't believe is really going to unlock important things in the repo. So, I mean, you tell us, like, of course, we want to minimize breaking changes, but there's some that are going to happen. What's the best, like, how do we best provide support for the community if that happens? I mean, and I can tee up the conversation a little bit. It might be, oh, we bundle them all together and, only release, like, they're bigger changes, but they're rarer. Or it might be, I don't know, better documentation or more hands-on help in Slack, or like there are a lot of directions that could go.
Hey, I'm not real familiar with your project history. Having used some other projects, maybe you guys can look to the communities there as examples. DBT is doing a good job with this, managing their versions. Prefect is doing a good job as well. I really prefer more frequent, smaller releases with accompanying like release notes or updates to the documentation. I find that easier for me to just roll into the next release. And if there's a breaking change, it's a minor breaking change. You know what I mean? The blast area is smaller versus a huge upgrade. I'm hesitant as a user to make that big leap if I know there's a lot of breaking changes and it's going to take me a week to sort through all of them.
When we do have these releases with breaking changes, is there a preferred way for you to be notified for this? Is it just announcements on Slack, or is it something like email that would actually be better in this case? And I'm curious what a lot of people think about that one.
My preference is a Slack channel dedicated to releases. I'm already there when I'm thinking about Great Expectations, so having a channel there that notifies the Slack community, so you get that notification icon.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So, sorry, and I missed what Adam was saying because I had to drop off the room for a little bit, but I don't know if that's what you were saying, but to me, I think the last time I worked with it, because on and off, but I talked a lot with you guys, was 0.9.4. And I read into the Slack channel, but I haven't really done anything with implementation, but I know for sure that everything's broken. Like if I just upgrade my stuff, and what I think I haven't seen directly is saying like, if you're jumping from this version, here are the specific, like this is how you should migrate off of this version until the next version. I think like it probably costs a lot, is a lot of effort, but I think like it makes it easier for people to migrate, like, this specific, like you are doing this way now, this API call is no longer there. This is the new way that you should call things on. And sorry if this is like repeating, but what was mentioned before. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, on that one, I will say we do have that documentation. It's buried right now, and we're actually literally, in fact, this week we've been moving those version upgrade guides, and then we also have one of our colleagues working on a CLI command that will automate the upgrade where that's possible for you. So great feedback. And I think that's something that we, as we get a more robust user base, we're just very cognizant of the need to support people going through that process. It looks like Abe actually dropped the link to that guide in our chat right now. And then what we're doing, that, like I mentioned this week, is we're kind of breaking it out to little how-to guides, like for every version. So if you're on version 9 and you want to go to version 10, you can click on the link upgrading to version 10, and then you can click on the link upgrading to version 11 and see exactly what changes between each of those.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll check that out.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't see that one actually.
And again, like as you get in and you're actually having to do this, please let us know. It's one of these things where basically we need the community to like communicate pain back to us at the appropriate level so that we can calibrate. We're trying to be really respectful and not introduce breaking changes when we don't have to, but there are going to be some for a while.
So just throw it out there, but it's really musing more than anything. I'm wondering if you have tests that you're doing, and when you are upgrading from version to version of your own tests, there's some way to automatically document parts where it's broken, so that on an example, make that part of the documentation for upgrading. This is how it looked before, and now this part, and now it looks this way, like git diff of your tests.
That's such a good idea. Yeah, and the beauty of Git is, I think because we do have a fairly robust test suite, including a variety of data context configurations and API calls and so forth. So just running a diff on our own test suite to look for that, and then writing that into a guide, it's just such a good idea. Oh, go ahead, Abe.
No, I was going to go to the same place. Ramon's
okay, I was just going to flag the question from Ramon about debugging strategies. And it looks like kind of there's sort of two parts there. Part one is it a problem to do 2 validations in a single script? Absolutely not. Totally normal. Great way to run GE. In fact, the only thing I would flag is that if you are using a validation operator, so if you're using the run validation operator API, then that API provides a mechanism for you to put in a list of all the validations that you want to have happen using that configuration already. So it actually even just becomes a single API call. For debugging, I have not used Azure ML pipeline, so I'm not sure exactly what debugging information you get, but we have one of our colleagues has spent a significant amount of time doing some work on ensuring Great Expectations runs in AWS Glue, which is also a heavily managed pipeline infrastructure. And so, of course, the challenge is that you end up with just a giant dump of logs, potentially several dumps of logs from a variety of different nodes. We've done a lot of work on improving the error messages that Great Expectations provides in those cases. So I guess my quick question back to you, Ramona, is do you have logs available to you from the runs that you could look at, or are you thinking more about like what are my options for doing local runs before I do a deployment? I think both of those are valid debugging strategies. Obviously, insofar as it's possible to mock out the infrastructure and run locally, that usually creates a faster dev loop. But if not, just curious what your situation is.
Sure. So basically, on this case, when I run it locally, it works just fine, like a charm. But when I run it on the remote, I get an internal server error. So I'm not sure if maybe it's a memory thing. I don't know.
So what I would encourage you to do is ask this question in Slack, and I'm going to connect you to my colleague Alex, the one who I was mentioning has done a lot of work with Glue. The thing that he found is that these environments, because of the way they're packaged, it could be a memory issue, but also there were a variety of things that he found with respect to, for example, dynamic loading. So Great Expectations does do some dynamic loading of different modules in order to support plugins. And that was another pain point that he found. And if you're getting some like very ambiguous error like that, it seems plausible to me that you're hitting something sort of more basic at Python, like, hey, we couldn't even do a dynamic import or something. But anyways, this is what our Discuss channel is like great for. So so I'd again encourage you to connect on Slack. But if you could put that exact question in Discuss, and like if you even have any log data that you could share, then what we can do is really help you work through it. We've been spending a lot of energy on this kind of problem. I hate to not give you an answer live, but
I know it's really hard with just the information I provided. Thank you. Anyway,
you'll be in great hands with
Anthony,
Alex. He's awesome.
Yeah,
and the great thing
he's
is that,
banged his
like,
head against a lot of these.
and once we figure it out and there is like a real how-to guide and it's tested, then it's great. Then Azure ML becomes yet another pipeline runner that is supported. So you kind of will help other people that use it, which is great.
This actually goes back also to Bob, your question. We've started kind of delineating these pipeline runners or orchestration systems into categories based on how users typically interact with them. If I could just poll the room, are most of you working first in in a local terminal, like where you have a full shell access, you have file system, and the whole sort of toolkit is available to you? Or are you working in an environment where you're interacting predominantly through a notebook, like whether that's SageMaker or Azure ML Notebook, if they have such an environment, I expect they do, or Google's Colab, where you have a remote server providing notebook, you could access a file system if you need to. Or are you running in an environment like Glue, and it sounds like perhaps Azure ML, where you're very constrained in terms of what operations are available to you outside of their pre-configured environment, or something else? Yeah.
So for me personally, right now, I'm running everything locally. I think my situation is a little unique because I'm sort of the black sheep of the company at the moment. I was hired to help out, and they kind of just said, go figure things out. So they have an infrastructure in place. They're actually scrapping the old infrastructure and starting new and changing platforms. So we are on AWS, we're moving to GCP, but they've asked me to come up with a way of assessing the data quality of the data files they're ingesting. So at the moment, I am doing everything on my local machine and then upload data from CSV files and things into the database that's on the cloud. Eventually, the goal is to move to, I guess, establish the expectations and then run them as the files get ingested on the cloud. So they have an SFTP server that dumps the files to a location, and then they're hoping that they'll be able to trigger an event that will then process the data and move them into the database and have that sort of system event-driven flow and pipeline set up. We're just not there yet, so I do everything locally.
Same here, everything locally. Of course, data is not local, so that's actually my pain point. So what I've been thinking to do, even to profile the data that I can't get to my local machine, is to just deploy a container and run a notebook there, because I can access data from a notebook running in a Docker image. I mean, in a Docker container.
Where is your data?
S3.
And are you processing it on that Docker image, or are you processing it on a Spark cluster?
processing on a Spark, or actually it's Mesos. So on Mesos you can run all kinds of services, including Spark jobs. So it's like precursor of Kubernetes in a sense, because everything is containerized, and you can have different kinds of workloads. You don't have to have a dedicated Spark cluster. That's a good point about that. So yeah, I mean, I guess everything is local, and then if it's remote, it's Dockerized.
Oh, sorry, Christina. So in this case, like you want to bring GE to the data, right? So basically you cannot
Yeah.
data to the laptop, right? But if the Docker with GE and profile runs inside AWS,
yes.
And did you build your own Docker container for this?
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. I mean, once I know how it works locally, then it's not a big deal.
So can this be an invitation to contribute? Because we heard several requests from people that would be great to have an image, like a kind of an official image of GE, that exactly for this purpose. And if you kind of develop it in a way that is not super custom to you,
right.
And if it can become a contribution, that would be super helpful to a lot of people.
Sure, yeah, that would be nice.
Okay, well, we can follow up. It's super happy.
All right.
Anthony, you've been pretty quiet. We're getting close to the end of the hour. I wanted to make sure you had some time to.
Yeah, sorry, I'm in the middle of my workday here. I kind of intended to be a fly on the wall. I would say my workflow is pretty similar to Bob and Christina's insofar as I actually run everything locally as well. So I'm the only person who's really responsible for creating and maintaining the data that we're using for building our models off of. So I'm running everything locally. I even run my validation locally. Just, you know, if I wake up in the morning and my cron job says that something went wrong somewhere, I have to go track that bug down. So I don't know how much that informs you guys, but yeah, I think I'm, from the sounds of it, in the same boat as Bob in terms of where I'm using Great Expectations.
Got it. Cool.
In my case, it's mostly for Azure ML pipeline. Basically, yeah, that's where my data is created, and that's where we want to check all the expectations. Mostly for the use case that Anders shared, which is knowing that the data quality is right before merging to master, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we're almost at the hour. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This has been really fun. I think we'll reach out again afterwards. If you've got any suggestions, like this is the first time we've done this. We're really excited to get just more face-to-face time with anybody who's interested. So if you've got feedback, if you've got questions that didn't get answered, anything like that, we'll ping you again afterwards, just so you've got a chance to voice those. And yeah, anything you can tell us to improve. We really, there's been some, I think, like good, focused, like constructive criticism of us, of the project, and we're very here for that. We're like, want to be as responsive as we can. So please keep coming.
Thanks. It was a nice meeting you.
Thank you.
Say thank you for everything you do. It's a great project. So keep it up.
Yeah, this was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Great meeting.
Thanks. And also, I'll also say I have never seen somebody so responsive and community focused as you.
Oh,
I think that's a big plus, actually.
That makes me super happy to hear that, right? Yeah. Because actually, with community support, like we have a real process. Like we even published a post, right? Like basically every week, one member of the team becomes kind of the the point person, right? While being supported by the rest of the team. So we are like this is really important for us.
Yeah, it's a very helpful approach. I'm very appreciative of that. So.
Yeah, you're totally right, Christina. When I was testing Azure's data drift, one of my questions, like they answered me like 2 weeks later for just asking for more information, you know? And this is Microsoft. And when I ask something in your Slack channel, I got answered the same day. So thank you a lot, guys.
Okay, I feel like my day was made. Thank you.
I was gonna say, everyone here, like Eugene is gonna be so happy. That's great. I mean, all of us are. That's so, and Kyle too. I mean, Kyle deserves so much credit, both of them.
Thanks again. I got to sign off. Take care.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great weekend. Thanks.